All she asked in return was one impossible thing: free my dad. No one believed the girl when she walked into the hospital room. She was small, wearing a worn yellow hoodie, standing in front of a man whose name controlled billion-dollar companies. Doctors, nurses, and lawyers filled the room, watching the silent billionaire who had not moved his body in years. Then the girl spoke calmly. "Free my dad," she said, looking directly at him, "and I'll heal you." For a moment, the room exploded with laughter, a poor child claiming she could cure the most powerful man in the city. It sounded impossible, but what happened next would make every person in that room stop laughing and start questioning everything they thought they knew. The courtroom in downtown Chicago was so crowded that people stood shoulder to shoulder along the walls, and the late afternoon light filtered through tall windows, casting long golden stripes across the polished wooden floor. Outside, the sounds of buses groaning and car horns drifting through traffic hummed faintly through the old courthouse walls. Inside, no one was talking. Every person in the room seemed to be holding their breath. At the front of the courtroom, Marcus Reed stood beside his public defender at the defendant's table. His shoulders were broad from years of hard work, but today they slumped under the weight of something heavier than exhaustion. His hands were folded tightly together, the way someone might hold them in prayer. Marcus wore a borrowed suit that didn't quite fit him. The sleeves were a little short, the collar scratched against his neck. But he stood straight anyway, doing his best to look respectful. And across the room, reporters scribbled in small notebooks. A few people whispered quietly in the back row. Everyone knew this case. A poor black man from Southside Chicago, caught stealing medicine. The kind of story people shook their heads about. At the bench, Judge Eleanor Carter adjusted her glasses and glanced down at the file in front of her. Her voice carried calm authority as she prepared to speak. "Mr. Marcus Reed," she said, her tone firm but measured, "you have been charged with theft of prescription medication from St. Gabriel Medical Center." Marcus swallowed but said nothing. He had already explained himself, explained about the medicine, explained about his daughter, explained about the night everything went wrong. But explanations didn't change the law. The prosecutor, a young man with sharp features named Daniel Porter, straightened his tie and glanced at the gallery. His expression carried the quiet confidence of someone certain he had already won. "Your Honor," Porter said earlier during the hearing, "while we sympathize with Mr. Reed's situation, the law cannot bend simply because someone has a sad story." Several people in the courtroom had nodded. Another desperate man from the South Side. That was the quiet judgment floating in the air. But Marcus Reed didn't argue. He had grown up in Chicago long enough to understand how the world sometimes looked at men who looked like him. Judge Carter lifted the small wooden gavel. "This court is prepared to deliver." Suddenly, a chair scraped loudly across the floor. A small figure slipped between two rows of seats. At first, but no one quite realized what was happening. Then people began to murmur. A little girl, no older than 6, walked quickly down the center aisle. Her curly hair bounced around her face as she moved. She wore a faded yellow dress that hung slightly too big on her thin frame, and her small sneakers squeaked faintly against the polished floor. "Wait!" someone whispered. The courtroom deputy stepped forward, startled, but the girl was already halfway to the front. Marcus turned. The moment he saw her, his face went pale. "Ava," he whispered under his breath. But the little girl didn't stop. She walked straight up to the front of the courtroom until she stood only a few feet from the judge's bench. Gasps spread through the room. Judge Carter blinked in surprise. "Child," she said gently. You can't be—" But Ava Reed wasn't looking at the judge. Her bright green eyes were focused on someone else. Across the courtroom, in the first row of seats reserved for observers, sat Richard Whitmore. Even people who had never met him recognized him instantly. the billionaire founder of Whitmore Technologies, one of the wealthiest men in Illinois. His presence in the courtroom had drawn reporters and cameras earlier that morning. Officially, he was there as a financial sponsor for a new city initiative focused on criminal justice reform. Unofficially, everyone knew his opinion carried enormous weight. Richard Whitmore sat perfectly still in a sleek black wheelchair. The chair looked expensive and modern, almost futuristic. His tailored suit was charcoal gray. His silver hair was neatly combed. His face was calm, controlled, as unreadable, but his eyes were sharp. They followed the little girl as she approached. Ava stopped in front of him. For a moment, the room was so quiet that even the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed loud. She took a small breath. Then she spoke. "Free my dad," she said clearly. Her voice was small, but somehow it carried across the entire room. "And I'll heal your legs." For a second, nobody reacted. Then the laughter started. It came in waves, a short snort from somewhere in the back, a nervous chuckle from a reporter, a loud laugh from a man near the door who shook his head. Did she just say, "You've got to be kidding"? Even the prosecutor let out a quiet scoff. Judge Carter tapped the gavel once. "Order," she said, though even she sounded slightly stunned. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, and embarrassment burned through him like fire. "Ava, baby," he called softly, his voice breaking. "Come back here." But Ava didn't move. She stood in front of Richard Whitmore with the steady confidence of someone who had made up her mind. Her hands rested at her sides, her chin lifted slightly, and she repeated herself. "If you let my dad go," she said, "I promise I'll make your legs work again." More laughter rippled through the room. A few people shook their heads. One reporter leaned toward another and whispered, "That's tomorrow's headline right there." But Richard Whitmore did not laugh, not even a little. His eyes stayed fixed on the girl. For a long moment, he said nothing. The courtroom gradually grew quiet again as people noticed his expression. Curiosity replaced amusement. But Richard leaned forward slightly in his chair. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm and low. "And how exactly," he asked, "do you plan to do that?" The question echoed softly through the courtroom. Ava shrugged in the simple way only a child could. "I don't know yet," she admitted. A few people chuckled again, but the girl continued. "My mom used to say miracles happen when people decide to be kind," she said. "And my dad says everyone deserves kindness, even when they don't think they do." Richard studied her face carefully. There was no fear there, no hesitation. Just a strange, steady certainty. Marcus felt his heart pounding. "Ava," he said again, louder now. "Sweetheart, please." But Ava looked back at her father and smiled. It was a small smile, but full of warmth. "It's okay, Daddy," she said. And then she turned back toward Richard Whitmore. "If you help my dad," she said softly, "I'll help you." Silence settled across the courtroom like snowfall. Judge Carter lowered the gavel slowly. The prosecutor frowned. Reporters stopped writing. And Richard Whitmore sat perfectly still in his wheelchair, staring at the little girl as if trying to understand something no one else in the room could see. Because for the first time in a very long time, he felt something strange stirring inside his chest. Not anger, not irritation. Something else. Something he hadn't felt since the accident that had taken his ability to walk. Hope. But the real question wasn't whether the girl believed what she said. The real question was something else entirely. So why would a child from one of Chicago's poorest neighborhoods believe she could change the life of a billionaire who had already given up on miracles? And more importantly, why did Richard Whitmore suddenly feel like he wanted to find out? 3 weeks earlier, long before the courtroom filled with reporters and whispers, The morning air in Southside Chicago smelled like coffee, cold pavement, and fresh bread from the small bakery on 63rd Street. At 4 in the morning, while most of the city was still asleep, Marcus Reed was already awake. The small apartment he shared with his daughter sat on the 3rd floor of a worn brick building near the Red Line tracks. Every few minutes, the rumble of a passing train shook the windows just enough to rattle the old kitchen cabinets. Marcus didn't seem to mind. When he stood at the stove in a faded gray t-shirt, flipping pancakes in a pan that had seen better days, steam curled toward the ceiling light, filling the tiny kitchen with the warm smell of butter. Behind him, sitting at the table with her legs swinging back and forth, was Ava. Her hair was still messy from sleep, her eyes bright even though the sun hadn't come up yet. "Daddy," she said between bites of pancake, "you made them extra fluffy today." Marcus smiled without turning around. "That's because today is Wednesday." Ava tilted her head. "What does Wednesday have to do with fluffy pancakes?" Marcus placed another pancake on her plate and finally turned around. "Wednesday," he said with a grin, "is the day we try to make the world a little better than it was on Tuesday." Ava considered that seriously, and then she nodded as if it made perfect sense. Outside the apartment window, the faint glow of streetlights reflected on wet asphalt from last night's rain. A city bus hissed to a stop at the corner, releasing a tired handful of early commuters into the cold morning. Marcus glanced at the clock. "We better get moving," he said. "The church kitchen opens in 20 minutes." Ava jumped from her chair and grabbed her backpack. Their routine rarely changed. Marcus worked mornings at a small community kitchen run by St. Luke's Church. It wasn't glamorous work. The pay was barely enough to cover rent and groceries. But Marcus never complained. To him, feeding people mattered. And in Southside Chicago, there were always people who needed to eat. By the time they stepped outside, the sky had turned a pale blue-gray. The air smelled like winter, even though autumn had only just begun. Marcus locked the apartment door and started down the sidewalk with Ava skipping beside him. They passed Mrs. Henderson's building on the corner. The elderly woman was struggling with 2 grocery bags that looked far too heavy for her thin arms. Marcus immediately stopped. "Morning, Mrs. Henderson," he said warmly. The woman looked up and smiled with relief. "Oh, Marcus, thank goodness it's you." He took the bags without hesitation. "You know you shouldn't be carrying all this by yourself." Mrs. Henderson chuckled softly. "Well, if I didn't try, I'd never see you." Ava giggled. They walked her all the way up to her apartment door before continuing down the street. A few blocks later, they passed a bus stop where a man wrapped in an old army jacket sat hunched against the cold. Marcus slowed. "Morning, Earl," he said. The man looked up. "Morning, Marcus." Marcus reached into the canvas bag slung over his shoulder and pulled out a small foil container. Inside were 2 of the pancakes from breakfast. Earl's eyes softened. "You didn't have to do that." Marcus shrugged. "Wednesday," he said simply. Ava gave the man a cheerful wave. By the time they reached St. Luke's Church, the sky had turned bright enough to reveal the worn graffiti on the brick walls nearby. Inside the community kitchen, fluorescent lights hummed overhead while volunteers moved around stainless steel counters. The smell of eggs, toast, and coffee filled the room. Marcus tied on an apron and got to work immediately. And he moved quickly but calmly, flipping eggs, stirring oatmeal, sliding trays of food across the counter to people who needed them. Most of the faces in line were familiar. A construction worker between jobs, a young mother with 2 children, an elderly veteran who always sat in the same corner table. Marcus greeted each one with the same steady kindness. "Morning, Mr. Lewis. How you holding up today, Angela? Don't forget extra syrup for the kids." He treated everyone like they mattered. Because to Marcus Reed, they did. Ava spent the morning at a small table near the kitchen door, coloring pictures while occasionally helping hand out napkins. Around mid-morning, the church door opened, and a tall man in a sharp business coat stepped inside. He paused just inside the doorway, looking slightly uncomfortable, while his polished shoes looked out of place on the scuffed church floor. Pastor Raymond walked over to greet him. "Can I help you?" The man cleared his throat. "I was told this place serves breakfast." Pastor Raymond nodded. "We do." He gestured toward the line of people waiting. The businessman hesitated for a moment, then quietly joined the end of the line. Marcus noticed him immediately, not because of the expensive coat, but because of the way the man looked around the room, confused, uncertain, like he had never been somewhere like this before. When his turn came, Marcus slid a plate across the counter. "Eggs, toast, and oatmeal," he said kindly. The man blinked. "You're not going to ask me anything?" Marcus wiped his hands on his apron. "Like what?" The man glanced around. "My situation. My story." Marcus shook his head. "Food doesn't need a story." The man stared at him for a moment. Then he sat down quietly and began to eat. Across the room, Ava watched her father. She had seen this scene play out hundreds of times, her dad helping people, listening to them, never asking for anything back. Sometimes she wondered how someone could be so kind when life had been so hard on him. But Marcus Reed never talked about that. He just kept showing up every morning and making Wednesdays better than Tuesdays. Outside the church windows, the wind began to pick up. Dark clouds gathered slowly over Chicago's skyline, and somewhere in the city, a chain of events had already begun moving quietly toward Marcus Reed's life. Events that would soon bring him face to face with a billionaire who had forgotten what kindness looked like. But first, something unexpected would happen on a cold night near the Red Line tracks. Something that would push the kindest man in Southside Chicago to make the most desperate decision of his life. The wind had picked up by the time Marcus and Ava returned home that evening. Chicago winters had a way of arriving early, creeping through the streets with sharp air that slipped through coats and cracked windows. The hallway of their apartment building smelled faintly of old carpet and someone's dinner cooking down the hall. Marcus unlocked their door and flicked on the kitchen light. The same small space greeted them. Worn table, chipped counter, the quiet hum of the refrigerator. Ava dropped her backpack beside the chair. Can I draw for a little while?" she asked. Marcus nodded as he set a small pot on the stove. "Homework first," he said with a playful grin. Ava rolled her eyes dramatically, but pulled out her notebook anyway. She liked school, but she liked drawing even more. Soon, crayons were spread across the table as she sketched little houses, smiling suns, and stick figures holding hands. Marcus stirred a pot of soup slowly, the steam fogging the window above the sink. For a few quiet minutes, life felt ordinary. Then Ava coughed. At first, it was just a small cough, the kind children make when the air is dry. Marcus glanced over. "You okay, baby?" Ava nodded. "I'm fine." But a few seconds later, she coughed again, this time harder. Marcus turned off the stove and walked over. Ava's small shoulders were shaking slightly. "Hey," he said gently, kneeling beside her chair. "Look at me." Her face had turned pale. Marcus felt the familiar knot tighten in his chest. Ava had been born with a heart condition. Most days she was fine. The doctors had told Marcus she could live a normal life as long as she had her medication and regular checkups. But sometimes, on cold nights like this, her breathing would change. Marcus touched her forehead. It felt warmer than it should. "Daddy," Ava whispered. Her voice sounded smaller than usual. "My chest hurts." Marcus felt the room spin slightly. "Okay," he said quickly, forcing calm into his voice. "It's okay. We've got medicine." He stood and walked to the kitchen cabinet where the small plastic bottle usually sat. His hand reached for it automatically, but when he opened the cabinet, the shelf was empty. As Marcus froze, he checked the drawer. Nothing. He checked the counter again, as if the bottle might magically appear. Then he remembered. The last dose had been yesterday. His stomach dropped. Ava coughed again from the table. Marcus grabbed his phone. The time read 8:12 p.m. The pharmacy down the street closed at 9. He hurried to Ava. "Put on your jacket," he said gently. "We're going for a little walk." Ava nodded weakly. They stepped outside into the cold night air. Streetlights glowed above the sidewalks, reflecting off wet pavement from earlier rain. The Red Line train thundered past overhead as they walked quickly toward the pharmacy. Marcus kept one hand on Ava's shoulder. "You doing okay?" he asked. She nodded again, though her breathing sounded tight. When they reached the pharmacy, Marcus pushed the door open quickly. The bright fluorescent lights made the store feel colder somehow. Behind the counter, a young pharmacist looked up. "Evening," she said. Marcus approached, Ava leaning slightly against him. "My daughter needs her heart medication," Marcus said quickly. "Refill for Ava Reed." The pharmacist typed into her computer. After a moment, her expression changed. "I'm sorry," she said. Marcus felt a chill run through him. "What do you mean?" "The insurance on file expired last month," she explained. "Without coverage, the medication costs—" She turned the screen slightly. Marcus stared. The number might as well have been 1,000 miles away. It was more than he made in 2 weeks. "I can pay next week," Marcus said quickly. "I just need it tonight." The pharmacist shook her head apologetically. "Mom, I wish I could help, but the system won't let me release it without payment." Ava tugged lightly on Marcus's sleeve. "Daddy?" Marcus forced a smile for her. "It's okay, baby. Just give Daddy a minute." He stepped outside the pharmacy and pulled out his phone. First he called the church office. Voicemail. Then Pastor Raymond. No answer. Then his friend Darnell. Straight to voicemail. Marcus leaned against the cold brick wall of the building. Across the street, a neon sign flickered outside a convenience store. Cars passed slowly through the intersection. Inside the pharmacy window, he could see the shelves filled with medicine. So many small bottles, so many chances to save someone. And one of them had his daughter's name on it. Marcus closed his eyes. He had never stolen anything in his life. Not once. Not even when things had been hard. Even when his wife got sick. Even when the hospital bills piled higher than the kitchen table. Marcus had always believed that doing the right thing mattered. But tonight, his daughter was struggling to breathe. He looked back through the glass window. The pharmacist had stepped away to help another customer. No one was near the counter. Marcus felt his heart pounding. His mind raced. Just one bottle. He could pay it back. He would pay it back. He always paid his debts. Marcus walked back into the store slowly. The bell above the door jingled softly. Ava sat on a chair near the entrance, her small body curled slightly under her jacket. Marcus squeezed her shoulder gently. "I'll be right back." He moved toward the counter. Each step felt heavier than the last. And behind the pharmacy window, the medication sat in a small white bag with Ava's name printed on the label. So close. Marcus reached for it. His fingers closed around the bag. For a second, the world seemed to stop. Then a voice spoke quietly behind him. "Sir." Marcus turned slowly. A store security guard stood near the end of the aisle. He looked tired more than angry. "Did you pay for that?" the guard asked. Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. For a moment, he considered running, but then he looked at Ava, sitting alone near the door, trusting him. Marcus slowly lowered his head. "No," he said quietly. The guard sighed. "Sir, I'm going to have to call the police." Marcus nodded. "I understand." Within minutes, flashing blue lights reflected across the pharmacy windows. 2 police officers stepped inside. They placed handcuffs gently around Marcus's wrists. Ava watched from her chair, confusion filling her eyes. "Daddy?" she whispered. Marcus knelt down carefully in front of her, the metal cuffs clinking softly. "Hey," he said softly. "It's going to be okay." "Are you in trouble?" Marcus swallowed. "Just a little mix-up." One of the officers shifted uncomfortably. "We'll take good care of your daughter tonight," he said gently. But Ava didn't look at the officer. She looked at her father. Tears shimmered in her eyes. Marcus kissed her forehead. "I love you more than anything in this world," he whispered. As the officers led him toward the door, Marcus looked back one last time. Ava stood in the bright pharmacy lights, clutching her jacket tightly. Outside, the cold Chicago wind carried the sound of the Red Line train roaring past overhead, and Marcus Reed realized something that broke his heart more than the handcuffs around his wrists. By morning, he would no longer be the man who made Wednesdays better than Tuesdays. He would be the man standing in a courtroom, accused of stealing, and the little girl who believed in miracles would be the only one who still believed in him. The words echoed through the cramped convenience store like a gunshot. "Thief!" the store manager shouted again, his voice sharp and loud enough to make every customer turn. "I saw you put it in your pocket!" Richard Whitmore stood frozen near the counter, one hand halfway inside the worn pocket of his dark wool coat. For a moment he didn't even understand what was happening. The store smelled of cheap coffee and overheated radiators. Outside, snow drifted slowly past the fogged windows, the orange glow of the streetlights turning the falling flakes into something almost peaceful. Inside, nothing felt peaceful at all. "I didn't steal anything," Richard said quietly. His voice was calm, almost too calm. The voice of a man who had spent decades negotiating million-dollar contracts without raising his tone. But this wasn't a boardroom. This was a small neighborhood store on the south side of Chicago, and no one here knew who he was. "Empty your pockets," the manager snapped. A few customers whispered to each other. A teenage cashier leaned over the counter to watch. Richard slowly removed his hand. In his palm was a small chocolate bar. He placed it gently on the counter. "I was going to pay for it," he said. The manager scoffed. "Yeah, sure you were." A large security guard stepped forward from the corner of the store, his boots heavy against the tile floor. "Sir," the guard said, already reaching for Richard's arm, "we're going to need you to stay here." Richard didn't resist. Not because he was afraid, because he was confused. This entire night had already gone sideways from the moment he stepped off the Red Line train and followed a quiet curiosity down unfamiliar streets. And now, somehow, he was being treated like a criminal over a $1 candy bar. Then a small voice spoke from behind him. He didn't steal it. The entire store went silent. Richard slowly turned. Standing near the refrigerated drinks was the little girl from the bus stop. The same girl in the bright yellow hoodie. Her curly hair framed her small face, and her dark eyes were wide but steady. Beside her stood her mother, the tired woman Richard had followed earlier that evening, the woman who worked as a maid in his downtown office building. She looked startled, confused by the situation unfolding in front of her. "Sweetheart," the mother whispered nervously, "don't get involved." But the girl stepped forward anyway. "I saw him," she said. Her voice was small but clear. He picked it up and walked to the counter. He was going to pay. The manager rolled his eyes. "And who are you? His lawyer?" "No," the girl said. She looked directly at Richard. "But he's not a bad man." Something about the way she said it made Richard's chest tighten. The security guard hesitated. The manager frowned. "Oh, kid, he said impatiently. Stay out of grown-up problems. But the girl didn't move. Instead, she walked up to the counter, reached into the pocket of her hoodie, and placed 2 crumpled dollar bills on the counter. I'll pay for it, she said. Richard stared at the money. 2 small bills, carefully folded. Probably saved for something important. Maybe lunch. Maybe a school snack. The manager grabbed the money and shoved the chocolate bar across the counter. Fine, he muttered. Take it and get out. The tension in the store slowly dissolved. Customers returned to their conversations. The security guard stepped back. Richard stood there for another second before picking up the candy bar. Then he turned to the girl. Thank you, he said quietly. The girl shrugged. You looked sad. Richard blinked. Sad? And he had been called many things in his life. Powerful, ruthless, brilliant. But never that. The girl's mother stepped forward quickly, embarrassed. I'm so sorry, she said. She shouldn't have interfered. Richard shook his head gently. No, he said. She did exactly what she should have done. He looked at the girl again. What's your name? Maya, she said. Richard nodded slowly. Maya, he repeated. For some reason, the name felt important, like a word he was supposed to remember. Outside, the snow had begun to fall harder. The streets were quiet now, the distant rumble of the Red Line train echoing through the cold Chicago night. Richard stepped out of the store with them. For a moment, the 3 of them simply stood beneath the flickering streetlight. Then Maya looked up at him. You're not from around here, she said. Richard smiled faintly. No, he admitted. Maya studied him with the strange seriousness only children could have. My mom says people who get lost sometimes find the thing they're supposed to find. Richard raised an eyebrow. And what do you think I'm supposed to find? Maya pointed at his chest. Hope. The word landed in the cold air between them. Richard felt something shift deep inside him. Something fragile. Something he hadn't felt in years. And suddenly, standing there on a quiet South Side sidewalk, with snow falling softly around them, Richard Whitmore realized something strange. For the first time in a very long time, he didn't want to go back to his empty penthouse. He wanted to know more about this girl, and the quiet life she seemed to believe could still hold miracles. The snow continued to fall, soft and steady, covering the sidewalks of South Side Chicago in a thin white layer that reflected the orange glow of the streetlights. Richard Whitmore stood still for a moment outside the small convenience store, watching the girl in the yellow hoodie as she tucked her hands into her pockets. Maya. The name lingered in his mind. Her mother adjusted the worn strap of her bag and gently touched Maya's shoulder. We should get home, she said quietly. Maya nodded, but before turning away, she looked back at Richard. You should go home too, she said simply. Richard almost laughed. Home. For most people, the word meant warmth, a couch, the smell of dinner cooking, the quiet comfort of family. For Richard, it meant a silent penthouse 40 floors above the city. Glass walls, cold marble floors, rooms that echoed when he walked through them. I suppose I should, he said. But his feet didn't move. Instead, he found himself walking beside them. Not too close. Just close enough to hear the soft rhythm of their footsteps crunching on the snow-covered sidewalk. The street was quiet. Most of the stores had already closed for the night. A distant train rattled across the elevated tracks somewhere down the block. Maya's mother glanced at him. You don't have to walk with us, she said politely. Richard nodded. I know. But he kept walking anyway. Maya didn't seem bothered by it. She walked ahead, kicking small piles of snow along the curb. After a moment, She looked back at him again. "Why were you sad?" she asked. Well, the question caught him off guard. Richard blinked. "Sad? You looked sad in the store," Maya said matter-of-factly. Her mother sighed softly. "Maya, honey, it's okay," Richard said gently. He considered the question. Why was he sad? The answer was complicated. Years of boardrooms, years of building a financial empire, years of watching relationships disappear one by one as success demanded more time, more attention, more sacrifice. And then, the quiet moments after it was all built, when he realized that everything he had gained had come at the cost of almost everything else. "I suppose," Richard said slowly, "sometimes people forget what they're working so hard for." Maya frowned thoughtfully. "That sounds confusing." Richard smiled faintly. "Oh, it is." They turned onto a narrower street lined with aging brick apartments. The buildings leaned slightly toward the road, their windows glowing softly in the winter night. Maya's mother finally spoke again. "You work downtown, don't you?" Richard looked at her. "What makes you think that?" "I clean offices," she said. "You have the same look as the men who stay late in those buildings." Richard chuckled quietly. "What kind of look is that?" "Tired," she said honestly. The word landed gently, but accurately. Tired. Not physically. Something deeper. They reached a small apartment building with chipped paint and a flickering entrance light. Maya ran ahead and pushed open the door. Warm air spilled out from the hallway. "This is us," her mother said. Richard nodded. For a moment, no one moved. Yeah, then Maya turned back toward him. "Do you still have the chocolate?" she asked. Richard reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the small candy bar. "Yes." "You should eat it," Maya said. "Why?" "Because sometimes small things help people feel better." Richard looked at the candy bar. It was probably the cheapest thing he had purchased in years, yet somehow it felt strangely important. "Good advice, Mute," he said. Maya grinned. Then she suddenly became serious again. "You should come back tomorrow." Richard blinked. "Why?" "Because my mom works late," Maya said. "And I wait for her at the bus stop." Her mother looked embarrassed. "Maya, don't bother the gentleman." But Maya ignored her. "You look like someone who needs a friend," she said. The simplicity of the statement made Richard's chest tighten again. A friend, but the word felt unfamiliar. Richard slipped the chocolate bar back into his pocket. "I'll think about it," he said softly. Maya seemed satisfied with that answer. She waved once before disappearing into the building. Her mother lingered for a second longer. "Thank you for walking with us," she said. Richard nodded. "Thank your daughter," he replied. "She believes the world is kinder than it really is," the woman said quietly. Richard watched the apartment door close behind her. For several seconds he stood alone on the snowy sidewalk. The city hummed softly around him. Then he slowly turned and began walking back toward the train station. But something inside him had shifted. For the first time in many years, Richard Whitmore felt something unfamiliar stirring beneath the layers of success, routine, and quiet loneliness. Oh, curiosity. And maybe hope. Because tomorrow night, for reasons he still didn't fully understand, Richard Whitmore knew exactly where he was going to be. The next evening, just after sunset, Richard stood again on the same South Side sidewalk. The cold was sharper tonight. Wind pushed loose snow across the pavement, and the distant rumble of the Red Line train echoed above the rooftops like a slow metal heartbeat. Richard checked his watch. 6:42 p.m. For a man who normally spent his evenings inside glass-walled conference rooms negotiating international investments, This place felt almost unreal. A cracked bus stop bench, a flickering streetlight, a row of small brick apartments with narrow staircases and uneven windows. But he waited anyway. He had left his office earlier than usual that afternoon, and his assistant had noticed. "Mr. Whitmore," she had said carefully, "you have 3 calls scheduled tonight." "Reschedule them," Richard replied without explanation. Now he stood with his hands in his coat pockets, watching the quiet street. For a moment, he wondered if he had imagined the entire encounter from the night before. Then he saw her. The yellow hoodie appeared first, bright against the gray winter street. Maya sat on the bus stop bench, swinging her feet slightly above the ground. She looked up almost immediately. When she recognized him, her face lit up. "You came back," she said. Richard smiled. "I said I might." Maya hopped off the bench and walked closer. "You were curious," she said confidently. Richard raised an eyebrow. "Is that your professional opinion?" Maya nodded seriously. My teacher says curiosity means you're still alive inside." Richard let out a soft laugh. "Your teacher sounds wise." "She is," Maya replied, "but she also gives too much homework." The bus stop was quiet. Cars passed occasionally, headlights reflecting off wet pavement. Richard noticed a small backpack beside Maya. "Are you waiting for your mother again?" he asked. "Yes." Maya kicked a small pile of snow with her boot. "She works late." Richard sat down on the cold metal bench beside her. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. The wind whistled softly through the empty street. Then Maya glanced at him again. "So what do you do?" she asked. Richard hesitated. The truthful answer would require explaining things that felt strange to say out loud. "I work with companies," he said simply. "Oh, like fixing them?" "Sometimes." "Like a doctor for businesses?" Richard considered that. "Yes," he said, "something like that." Maya seemed satisfied. "My mom says rich people only care about money," she said casually. Richard didn't respond right away. "Your mom might not be wrong," he admitted. Maya tilted her head. "But you don't look like someone who cares about money." Richard chuckled softly. "That's ironic." "Why?" "Because most people would say the opposite." Maya studied his face again. Then she said something that made him pause. "You look like someone who forgot something important." The words were simple, but they landed heavily. Richard leaned back against the bench. "Maybe I did." The wind grew stronger, rattling the loose metal sign above the bus stop. For the first time, Richard really looked at the neighborhood around him. Paint peeling from old buildings, a street lamp buzzing faintly overhead, the faint smell of fried food drifting from a nearby diner. And yet, there was a strange warmth in the place, a feeling he rarely experienced in the polished skyscrapers downtown. "Why do you wait here alone?" he asked gently. Maya shrugged. "It's safer to wait where there are lights." That answer told him more than she realized. Then she reached into her backpack. "I brought something," she said. She pulled out a small folded paper bag and handed it to him. "What's this?" Richard asked. "Dinner," Maya said proudly. Richard opened the bag. Inside was a peanut butter sandwich wrapped in wax paper. "You made this?" Maya nodded. "For you." Richard stared at the sandwich, as no one had made him food in years, not personally, not like this. "You don't have to give this to me," he said quietly. Maya shrugged again. "My mom says sharing is how you make the world less lonely." Richard felt a tightness in his throat. Before he could respond, a city bus roared past the intersection. Moments later, a familiar figure appeared walking quickly down the sidewalk. Maya jumped up. "Mom!" Her mother looked surprised to see Richard again. You came back, she said cautiously. Richard nodded. I was curious. Maya's mother looked between them. Then she noticed the sandwich in Richard's hands. Maya, she said gently. It's okay, Richard said. He held up the sandwich. This might be the best dinner I've had all week. Maya beamed. Her mother sighed, half amused and half embarrassed. Oh, you really shouldn't encourage her, she said. But Richard shook his head. Encouraging kindness seems like a good idea. For a moment, the three of them stood together beneath the buzzing streetlight. Snow began falling again. Soft, quiet, almost peaceful. And Richard Whitmore realized something unexpected. The most valuable thing he had experienced in months was happening on a cracked bus stop bench on the south side of Chicago. But he didn't know yet that this simple moment was about to lead him into the most important decision of his entire life. Snow drifted softly around the bus stop as the three of them stood beneath the dim streetlight. Richard held the peanut butter sandwich carefully, as if it were something fragile. Maya's mother brushed snow from Maya's shoulders and looked back at Richard. You really don't have to stand out here with us, she said politely. It's freezing. Richard glanced at the sandwich in his hand. I've spent many evenings in colder places, he replied. That was technically true, but the cold he meant wasn't weather. It was the quiet emptiness of expensive rooms where no one waited for him. Maya sat back down on the bench. So what happens now? She asked. Richard looked at her. What do you mean? You came back, she said. So what happens next? Richard smiled faintly. He had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions, orchestrated international deals, and made decisions that shaped entire companies. But he had no idea how to answer a 10-year-old's simple question. I suppose we talk, he said. Maya nodded. Okay. Her mother sat beside her, pulling her coat tighter. For a moment, they simply watched the snowfall. Then Maya spoke again. My mom says people with big jobs don't usually sit at bus stops. Richard chuckled. Your mom is probably right. Then why are you here? He thought about the answer. Because you reminded me that kindness still exists. Because you gave away your last $2 to help a stranger. Because your small act made my entire world feel less empty. But he didn't say any of that. Instead, he said something simpler. Because sometimes important things happen in small places. Maya seemed satisfied with that. Her mother, however, studied him more carefully now. You're not just some office worker, are you? She asked. Richard hesitated. What makes you think that? You listen too carefully, she said. The observation surprised him. But most people only saw the expensive suit, or the confident posture, or the quiet authority he carried. But this woman had noticed something else. Listening. Old habit, Richard said. What's your name? She asked. He paused. For a moment, he considered giving a different name. Something simple. Something anonymous. But something about the quiet honesty of the moment made that feel wrong. Richard, he said. She nodded. I'm Angela. Richard recognized the name immediately. Angela, the woman who cleaned the conference floor of his own company building every night. But she clearly didn't recognize him. In the towering office building downtown, men like Richard rarely looked twice at the people who quietly cleaned their offices after midnight. And now, standing beneath a flickering streetlight on the south side, the roles felt strangely reversed. Nice to meet you, Angela, Richard said. Before she could respond, Maya suddenly spoke again. Mom, she said quietly. Angela turned. What is it, honey? Maya pointed down the street. A man stood near the corner, watching them. He wore a heavy jacket and leaned against a street sign. Richard noticed him immediately. The man looked away quickly when their eyes met. Angela's expression changed. "Come on," she said softly to Maya. "Let's go inside." Richard felt the tension in her voice. "Is everything okay?" he asked. Angela forced a small smile. "Yes, just neighborhood things." But Richard had spent decades reading people in negotiation rooms. He knew when someone was pretending. Yet the man across the street lit a cigarette and continued watching. Maya moved closer to her mother. Richard stood slowly. "I can walk you to the door," he said. Angela hesitated. Then she nodded. "Thank you." They began walking toward the apartment building together. Snow crunched beneath their boots. Richard could still feel the man's eyes following them. When they reached the building entrance, Angela turned to him. "You don't have to worry," she said. "We're used to this neighborhood." Richard looked back down the street. The man had already disappeared. "Used to it doesn't mean it's safe," Richard said quietly. Angela didn't respond. She simply opened the building door. Warm air spilled out again from the hallway. Maya stepped inside first. Before Angela followed her, she looked back at Richard. "Well, you really didn't have to come back," she said. Richard considered that. Maybe she was right. Maybe returning had been unnecessary, illogical, out of character. But as he looked at the small apartment building, at the narrow stairwell, at the quiet life unfolding inside those walls, he realized something. For years he had been building an empire designed to control everything. Money, power, outcomes. Yet standing here tonight, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Responsibility. Not the corporate kind. Something human. "Maybe I did," Richard said softly. Angela studied his face for a moment. Then she gave a small nod. "Good night, Richard." "Good night." The door closed behind them. Richard stood alone again on the snowy sidewalk. But this time, the quiet didn't feel empty. Well, it felt like the beginning of something. And far above the city skyline, inside a glass office tower where hundreds of employees worked under his authority, an entirely different problem was waiting for him. One that would collide with this quiet South Side bus stop sooner than he ever expected. The next morning, downtown Chicago woke beneath a pale winter sky. Glass towers reflected the early sunlight like enormous mirrors. Traffic crawled through the financial district as professionals hurried into buildings carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Inside the tallest of those towers, the atmosphere felt very different from the quiet bus stop on the south side. Tension filled the air. Richard Whitmore stepped out of the elevator onto the executive floor of Whitmore Capital. The hallway was silent except for the low hum of heating vents. His assistant stood the moment she saw him. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore." "Good morning, Claire." She hesitated. "You have an urgent meeting scheduled in 10 minutes. Richard removed his coat slowly. "Urgent?" Claire lowered her voice. "The board arrived early." That was unusual, very unusual. Board members rarely arrived before their scheduled time unless something had gone wrong. Richard walked down the hallway toward the conference room. Through the glass wall he could already see them. 5 men, 2 women, all seated around the long, polished table. Their expressions were serious. The moment he entered the room, the conversation stopped. "Richard," one of them said. "Harold Benton, 70 years old, former banker, and currently the most influential voice on the Whitmore Capital Board." "You're late," Harold said. Richard glanced at the clock. "I'm 2 minutes early." "That's not what I meant." Richard sat down calmly at the head of the table. "So," he said, "what's the emergency?" Another board member slid a tablet across the table. Richard looked at the screen. A development proposal. Location, South Side Chicago. Specifically, a cluster of aging apartment buildings near the Red Line tracks. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. He recognized the street immediately. The bus stop. Maya. Angela. "What is this?" he asked quietly. Harold folded his hands. "A redevelopment project." Richard kept reading. The proposal described demolishing several low-income housing blocks and replacing them with a modern commercial complex, as retail spaces, luxury apartments, parking structures, projected profit, extremely high. Richard looked up slowly. "Who approved this?" "We did," Harold replied. Richard leaned back in his chair. "And when exactly did the board vote on this project?" Harold didn't answer immediately. "That's not the point." "It's exactly the point," another board member spoke up. "The area is underutilized. The property values are extremely low, which makes it perfect for redevelopment. Investors are already interested." Richard placed the tablet back on the table. "And the people who live there?" he asked. A quiet silence followed. Harold finally spoke again. "They'll be relocated." "Where?" "That's not our responsibility." The words were spoken casually. Practically, the language of business. What Richard had heard that tone many times before. He had used it himself in the past. But today it sounded different, because he could see their faces. Maya sitting on the bus stop bench. Angela walking home after work. The apartment building door closing behind them. "You're planning to tear down half that neighborhood," Richard said slowly. Harold nodded. "It's an excellent investment opportunity." Richard looked around the room. Every face was watching him. Waiting. "This project begins construction in 3 months," Harold continued. "Contracts are already being drafted." Richard stood up. The room grew quiet. He walked slowly toward the conference room window overlooking the city. 40 floors below, the streets moved like a living map. Cars, people, lives unfolding in thousands of directions. Yet, and somewhere far south of this tower, a small girl in a yellow hoodie was probably walking to school. "You should have told me," Richard said. Harold stood as well. "Richard, this company answers to the board. And I built this company." "Yes," Harold replied calmly. "And now it belongs to shareholders." Richard turned slowly. For the first time since entering the room, his voice carried something new, something colder. "Do you know who lives in those buildings?" he asked. "No." "Have you ever walked those streets?" "No." "Have you ever sat at that bus stop?" Harold frowned. "What does that have to do with anything?" Richard didn't answer right away, because the truth was simple. Everything. That bus stop had changed something in him, something the board didn't understand, but something the spreadsheets couldn't measure. Harold finally spoke again. "The decision has already been made." Richard looked at the tablet on the table. Then he looked back at the board. "No," he said quietly. "It hasn't." The room went silent, because everyone there knew something important. Richard Whitmore rarely said no, but when he did, entire industries listened, and for the first time since the meeting began. The board members realized something they hadn't expected. This redevelopment project was about to become a fight. The conference room remained silent for several long seconds. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago stretched across the winter morning like a frozen ocean of steel and glass. Inside, the temperature had dropped several degrees. Richard Whitmore slowly returned to the head of the table, and Harold Benton leaned forward, his fingers folded carefully. "Richard," he said in the measured voice of a man used to controlling rooms like this, "you're reacting emotionally. Richard sat down again. That's possible, he said calmly. A younger board member cleared his throat. But the numbers are undeniable, he said. The redevelopment would increase the company's annual returns by nearly 20%. Another voice joined. Shareholders expect growth. Investors are already asking questions. Back out now and we look weak. The words stacked one after another like bricks in a wall. Richard listened. For years he had spoken those same arguments. Profit, efficiency, expansion. They were the language that had built Whitmore Capital into one of the most powerful investment firms in the Midwest. Oh, but now those numbers had faces attached to them. A yellow hoodie at a bus stop. A tired mother walking home after cleaning offices all night. An aging apartment building with chipped paint and flickering lights. Richard picked up the tablet again. How many buildings? He asked. 7, Harold replied. How many residents? Approximately 200. And relocation? A brief pause. Assistance programs, Harold said vaguely. Richard nodded slowly. That answer told him everything, which meant there wasn't a real plan, just paperwork. Construction contracts are nearly finalized, Harold continued. The demolition phase begins in 90 days. Richard set the tablet down again. 90 days, he repeated. Harold leaned forward slightly. This isn't personal, Richard. Oh, it's business. Richard looked directly at him. That's the problem. A few board members exchanged glances. Harold frowned. What does that mean? It means business decisions don't happen in a vacuum, Richard said. These buildings aren't empty warehouses. People live there. And people live everywhere, Harold replied. That doesn't stop development. Another board member spoke up. Cities evolve. Neighborhoods change. Progress requires difficult choices. Richard stood again. He walked slowly around the table, not with anger, with control. I've spent 30 years building this company, he said quietly. Do you know why Whitmore Capital succeeded when so many other firms collapsed? No one answered. Because we learned to see risk where others didn't. He tapped the tablet screen. Oh, you see opportunity here. He paused. I see consequences. Harold shook his head. This project is already moving forward. Then pause it. That's not how the board operates. Richard stopped walking. Then maybe the board needs to remember something. The room grew still. Claire, his assistant, stood quietly near the door, pretending to organize papers while clearly listening to every word. Harold spoke carefully. Richard, are you threatening to override the board? Richard looked around the room, at the men and women who now controlled large portions of the company he had once run alone, at the investors who believed profit justified everything. Then he spoke. I'm asking for 30 days. 30 days for what? Harold asked. To visit the neighborhood. Several board members laughed softly. You want to walk around the south side? One of them said. Richard didn't smile. Yes. Harold rubbed his temple. Richard, with all respect, you're the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar firm. Exactly. And CEOs don't conduct neighborhood tours before approving projects. Maybe they should. Silence settled over the room again. Finally, Harold sighed. You're serious? Yes. Another board member leaned forward. Even if we pause the vote, she said, this won't change the financial reality. Richard nodded. I'm aware. So what exactly do you think you'll find there? Richard thought about the answer. A bus stop bench. A peanut butter sandwich wrapped in wax paper. A small girl who believed miracles were possible. But he simply said, the truth. Harold studied him carefully. After a long moment, he finally spoke. Fine, Several heads turned toward him. 30 days, Harold said. No demolition contracts signed until then. But after that? Richard met his eyes. After that, we decide. The board members slowly began gathering their papers. The meeting was ending. But something had changed. The quiet confidence that normally surrounded Richard Whitmore had been replaced by something else. Uncertainty. And outside the glass tower, far beyond the polished floors and executive offices, the neighborhood near the Red Line tracks continued its ordinary day. Children walking home from school, neighbors greeting each other on cracked sidewalks, a girl in a yellow hoodie sitting at a familiar bus stop. But none of them knew yet that the future of their entire neighborhood had just become the center of a battle happening 40 floors above the city. That evening, the South Side looked exactly the same as it had the night before. The streetlights buzzed softly. Cars rolled slowly through wet intersections. A thin layer of snow still clung to the sidewalks, where footsteps had not yet disturbed it. Life continued as it always did. And at the small bus stop near the Red Line tracks, Maya sat on the familiar metal bench with her backpack resting beside her. She swung her feet slowly while watching the passing traffic. The air smelled faintly of fried food drifting from a nearby diner. Across the street, an old grocery store glowed under fluorescent lights. It was the kind of ordinary winter evening that no one would remember. Except Richard Whitmore was walking toward it again. He had left the office early. Again. Claire had noticed. "You've canceled 3 meetings this week," she said carefully before he left. "Reschedule them," Richard replied. But Claire had watched him closely. Executives like Richard Whitmore didn't suddenly abandon evening schedules, not without a reason. Now he walked slowly down the familiar street toward the bus stop. His expensive shoes made quiet crunching sounds on the snow. And for the second time that week, the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company returned to a place that did not belong to his world. Maya spotted him almost immediately. Her face lit up. "You came back again!" Richard smiled. "I said I might." Maya hopped up from the bench. "You're doing the curiosity thing again." Richard chuckled. "I suppose I am." He sat beside her on the cold metal bench. For a moment they simply watched the street. Then Maya looked at him carefully. "You look different today." "How so?" "You look worried." Richard considered that. "Maybe I am." "Why?" He hesitated. "How do you explain corporate redevelopment plans to a 10-year-old? How do you describe investment boards and demolition contracts and profit margins?" Instead, he asked a different question. "Maya," he said, "how long have you lived here?" "All my life." "Do you like it?" She looked around the street, at the small shops, the bus stop, the apartment building where she and her mother lived. "It's home," she said simply. That answer carried more weight than she understood. Richard nodded slowly. A bus passed by, blowing cold air across the sidewalk. Then Maya asked something unexpected. "Why do rich people build new things where other people live?" Richard blinked. "Who told you that?" "My friend's family had to move last year," she said. "They said some company bought their building." Richard felt the words land like quiet stones in his chest. What happened to them? "They moved far away." She kicked the snow again. "My friend said her new school is lonely." Richard didn't know what to say, because for the first time, he wasn't hearing about redevelopment in a boardroom. He was hearing it from someone who lived inside the consequences. Maya looked up at him. "Are you rich?" she asked suddenly. Richard laughed softly. "That's a complicated question." "But you dress like the people on TV." Richard looked down at his coat. She wasn't wrong. "Yes," he admitted. I suppose most people would say I am." Maya thought about that. Then she asked the question that changed everything. "If you're rich, Can you stop people from losing their homes? Richard stared at her. The simplicity of the question made the truth unavoidable. He could, or at least, he had the power to try. Before he could answer, a familiar voice called out, "Maya!" Angela was walking toward them quickly, her work bag over her shoulder. She looked tired, more tired than usual. "Hi," Richard said when she reached them. Angela nodded politely. "Good evening." But her attention shifted to Maya. "Did you finish your homework?" "Yes." "Did you stay near the lights?" "Yes." Angela sighed with relief and sat beside her daughter. Richard noticed something. Her hands were shaking slightly. "Long day?" he asked. Angela forced a small smile. "The building downtown was busier than usual." Richard understood immediately. The building downtown. His building. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Angela shrugged. "It's work." For a moment, none of them spoke. Then Maya looked between them. "Richard says rich people can fix problems," she announced. Angela raised an eyebrow. "Did he?" Richard rubbed the back of his neck. "I may have implied something like that." Angela gave him a tired smile. "Well, if you know any rich people who want to fix broken elevators and leaking ceilings, send them our way." Richard looked at the apartment building across the street. Paint peeling. Windows fogged with winter condensation. He imagined the development proposal again. Demolition. Luxury apartments. Retail space. Parking garages. And suddenly, the numbers on that spreadsheet didn't look like profit projections anymore. They looked like eviction notices. Maya tugged his sleeve. "You didn't answer my question," she said. Richard looked at her. "Which question?" "If rich people can stop people from losing their homes." Snow began falling again, soft flakes drifting through the yellow glow of the streetlight. Richard Whitmore looked down the quiet street, then back at the small apartment building. And for the first time since the board meeting, he said the only honest thing he could. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but only if they choose to." The words lingered in the cold air like falling snow. Maya stared at him for a moment, thinking hard about what he had said. Children had a way of taking complicated ideas and turning them into something simple. "Oh, so it's a choice," she said finally. Richard nodded slowly. "Yes." Maya seemed satisfied with that answer, but Angela was watching him differently now. Not suspicious, just curious. "Most people with power don't talk like that," she said quietly. Richard gave a small smile. "Most people with power spend their time in rooms where no one asks the right questions." Angela glanced at Maya. "Well," she said, "Maya asks a lot of questions." "That might save the world one day," Richard replied. They all laughed softly. For a moment, the bus stop felt warmer. Then Angela stood up. "Come on, Maya," she said. "Let's get home before it gets colder." Maya grabbed her backpack, but before leaving, she turned to Richard again. "Are you coming tomorrow?" Richard hesitated. Tomorrow meant another board meeting, more pressure, or more arguments about profit margins and investment returns. But when he looked at Maya's hopeful face, the answer came easily. "Yes," he said. Maya grinned. "Good." Angela gave him a polite nod. "Good night, Richard." "Good night." They crossed the street toward their apartment building. Richard stayed at the bus stop bench, watching until the door closed behind them. Snow drifted quietly around him. For a long moment, he didn't move. Instead, he thought about something Maya had said earlier. It's a choice. And suddenly he realized something important. The board believed this redevelopment project was inevitable. They believed the numbers made the decision for them. But numbers didn't make decisions. People did. Richard stood and slowly began walking toward the train station. While the red line tracks rattled overhead as a train passed, sparks briefly flashing against the dark sky. He pulled out his phone. There was one call he needed to make. The line rang twice. "Mr. Whitmore?" Claire answered. "Claire, I need you to prepare something for me." "Yes, sir. I want every document related to the South Side redevelopment project. All of them? Every report, every contract draft, every financial projection." There was a brief pause. "Is something wrong with the project?" Richard looked back down the street, toward the bus stop, toward the apartment buildings, toward the quiet neighborhood that had unknowingly become the center of a corporate battle. "Claire," he said calmly, I want to understand exactly what the board thinks they're buying. I'll have everything ready tomorrow morning." "Thank you." He hung up. The train station entrance appeared ahead, its stairs descending into the warm underground platform. But Richard stopped walking. Because across the street, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. A notice posted on the wall of a nearby building. Bright orange paper, flapping slightly in the winter wind. Richard crossed the street. The notice had been taped to the brick beside the apartment entrance. He stepped closer. The words were printed in bold letters. "City Property Survey Notice Preliminary Redevelopment Assessment. Authorized personnel will be conducting structural inspections." Richard read the document carefully. There were several of them taped along the building. As inspection notices, survey permits, legal language designed to sound harmless. But he knew exactly what they meant. The process had already started. The board had begun moving forward before even telling him, before the 30 days he had demanded, before any real discussion. Richard looked up at the windows above. Inside one of those apartments, Maya was probably finishing homework. Angela might be making a late dinner. They had no idea what those notices meant. But Richard did. And something inside him hardened. For the first time since this entire situation began. He wasn't just curious. He was angry. Because someone had already decided the future of this neighborhood, without asking the people who lived here. Richard stepped back from the wall. Snowflakes landed on the orange notices, melting slowly against the paper. And somewhere deep inside his mind, a plan was beginning to form. A plan the board of Whitmore Capital would never see coming. The next morning, Chicago woke beneath a sky the color of cold steel. Snow had stopped during the night, leaving the city covered in a quiet white blanket that softened the sharp edges of buildings and sidewalks. Downtown, the towers of the financial district glittered in the pale winter sunlight. Inside Whitmore Capital, the executive floor hummed with its usual controlled energy. Phones rang, assistants moved between offices carrying folders and tablets. But something about the atmosphere felt different. Richard Whitmore arrived earlier than anyone expected. Claire noticed immediately. "You're here before 7, she said, looking surprised. And Richard removed his coat and handed it to her. "Did you gather the documents I asked for?" Claire nodded. "They're in your office." She hesitated before adding, "And there's a lot more than you might expect." Richard walked into his office. The floor-to-ceiling windows looked out across Lake Michigan, where sheets of ice floated slowly near the frozen shoreline. But Richard's attention was on the thick stack of folders sitting on his desk. Survey permits, property valuations, construction projections, demolition estimates. He began reading. The deeper he went into the documents, the clearer the picture became. The board had not only approved the redevelopment project, they had already begun laying the groundwork, quietly, efficiently, and without informing him. One document caught his attention, on a private investment agreement. Richard read the names listed on the page: 3 investment funds, 2 real estate groups, and one name he recognized immediately. Benton Development Group, Harold Benton's personal firm. Richard leaned back slowly in his chair. So that was the real story. This wasn't just about corporate growth. It was about personal profit. The redevelopment project would make millions for investors connected directly to the board. And the residents living in those aging apartment buildings? They were simply obstacles. Richard closed the folder. His phone buzzed. Claire's voice came through the intercom. "Mr. Whitmore, Harold Benton is here." Richard looked at the documents spread across his desk. "Send him in." A moment later, Harold entered the office, but he walked with the slow confidence of a man who believed the situation was already under control. "Morning, Richard," he said. Richard gestured toward the chair across the desk. "Sit down." Harold sat. His eyes briefly scanned the folders on the desk. "You've been busy." "I've been reading." Harold smiled faintly. "You'll see the numbers make sense." Richard slid the investment agreement across the desk. Harold glanced at it. Then he sighed. "I was hoping you wouldn't notice that yet. Your development company is involved." "Yes." "And several other board members have private investments tied to this project." Harold didn't deny it. "Of course they do." Richard folded his hands. "So this isn't just a company decision?" "No. It's a personal one." Harold leaned forward slightly. "Richard, this is how the world works." Richard remained silent. Harold continued. "Those buildings are deteriorating. The neighborhood is struggling. Development will bring jobs, businesses, and tax revenue. And displacement." Harold shrugged. "Change always displaces someone." Richard stood and walked toward the window. The frozen lake stretched to the horizon. "When I built this company," he said quietly, "I believed we could create opportunity without destroying communities." Harold chuckled softly. "That's a nice speech." Richard turned back toward him. "But you and I both know that's not how the market works." Richard walked back to the desk. "Maybe the market needs different leadership." Harold raised an eyebrow. "You're still thinking emotionally." "No," Richard said. "I'm thinking strategically." He opened another folder and placed it on the desk. Harold frowned. "What's this?" "A full audit of the redevelopment contracts." Harold looked confused. "Why would you?" "Because several of these agreements violate our company's internal ethics guidelines." Harold's expression changed. "Those guidelines are flexible." "Not when shareholders start asking questions." Harold leaned back slowly. "You're threatening to expose the project." Richard met his eyes. "I'm threatening to slow it down." "How long?" Richard didn't hesitate. "Long enough." Harold stood. "You're making a mistake." "Maybe." "You'll lose support on the board." "Maybe." "And when investors hear about this?" Richard gave a calm smile. "Then we'll see which story they prefer." Harold narrowed his eyes. What story is that?" Richard walked to the door and opened it. "The story where a company chooses people over profit." Harold stared at him. "You really think that will win?" Richard thought about the bus stop, the peanut butter sandwich, the girl in the yellow hoodie. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I know one thing." "What's that?" Richard looked directly at him. "This fight is only getting started." And far across the city, in a quiet South Side neighborhood, Maya walked home from school beneath the cold winter sun. She had no idea yet that the kind stranger who sat with her at the bus stop had just declared war inside one of the most powerful boardrooms in Chicago. And maybe that's the strangest part of life. The biggest battles don't always start with loud arguments or dramatic moments. Sometimes they begin with something small. A simple question from a child, a sandwich shared at a cold bus stop, or a moment when someone finally decides to do the right thing. Now I want to ask you something. If you were in Richard's position, what would you do? Would you protect the neighborhood? Or would you choose the money? Let me know in the comments. If you believe Richard made the right choice, comment 1. If you think the board might still win this battle, comment 0. Just type 1 or 0 so I can see what you think. And if this story touched your heart even a little, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Because tomorrow, I'll bring you another powerful story about kindness, courage, and the unexpected moments that can change someone's life forever. Thank you for watching. And remember, sometimes the smallest act of kindness can start the biggest change.